So one day, 30 some years ago, I'm out and about with my mom and a friend of hers. And I remember it was in the evening, and I remember where it was very vividly because it was one of the many, many times that my mother was screaming hysterically at me about, well, there wasn't really ever much of a reason. I know a lot of people think that I'm exaggerating about something like this, but people who've known me for a while know that I'm not, and some have witnessed this themselves. And this friend of hers she knew through her charismatic Catholic movement. To make a long story short, they were kind of peripheral to the Catholic Church and weird frauds, is how I would summarize them. So my mom's screaming at me, and her friend asked me, "Why do you do this to your mother?" Because I must have done something, right? Because people don't behave like that. They just don't, you know. I would emphasize that at this time, I didn't swear, I didn't mouth off. I was quite a good little kid. I had a speech impediment and big glasses, and I just really loved cats. That's pretty much the summary of me. I wasn't exactly a bad kid. I know that people like to tell the half of the story that appears to benefit them, but there's not really anything missing here. So her friend, her name was Lavon, says, "Why do you do this to your mother? Why do you make her this way?" And I'm crying, and I'm saying, "I didn't do anything." So Lavon gets down in front of me, and she gets me by the shoulders, and she says, "This is the Holy Spirit speaking through me. Why do you do this to your mother?" This was at a time when I took the pseudo-religion seriously, and the whole thing was, needless to say, pretty horrifying. Fast forward maybe a few weeks, maybe a few months, maybe even a couple years, who knows. And I'm at home, I'm in my bedroom, and my mom and Lavon are in the kitchen down the hall. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the telltale screaming starts. And I wasn't paying a lot of attention to what it was about because it was extremely routine. My mom would go on rampages where she'd be smashing and destroying things and screaming and the whole thing. Sometimes, punching and kicking holes in walls, and, the list goes on and on. So for me, it was just par for the course. It didn't matter what the supposed reason was, but I remember so vividly I stuck my head around the corner just in time to see my mom throw the front door open and lift Lavon up and throw her out the door physically. And the next day, when my mom is gone, Lavon calls and she says, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah." Business as usual, you've seen it. What do you want? What do you want me to tell you? And I'll never forget, she says, "I think there's something really wrong with your mother." Really? Well, welcome to the party. Thanks for getting on that bandwagon eventually the hard way. The question is, how did it come to this? And what on earth does this charming tale have to do with the picture on the podcast video? Well, this is a video about generational abuse. A major reason why I got into all of this genealogy and ancestry and background and all this morbid, boring crap is because the screwy household that I grew up in, it was dawning on me that this was something that came down through the generations. And boy, did it ever. And I've seen this in many other ancestries that I've worked on also. And sometimes, as in my case, you find even a specific moment when all things went bad. And sometimes, not necessarily, it's just a bunch of scumbags having kids so that they can dump their scumbaggery on another generation, and so on and so forth. And I've seen plenty of that too. So, my mom, I would describe as a very broken individual, a raving lunatic, and of course, people are going to think that's an exaggeration. Not hardly. She's been diagnosed with everything under the sun. The core of all of this is that everything was mother's fault. Mother this and mother that. That mother would beat her all the time, that kind of thing. And I did grow up around my grandma a lot. My grandma was really great to me. In fact, she was my refuge from my mother because those two were the only family that I had growing up. And I would hear these stories about mother, but to me, she was just 5 feet tall and liked to drink. I called her the Smurf because, when she's 5 feet and I get to 6'2", she was extremely not intimidating. She would put me to work in the summers and she'd pay me a little bit of money, and she was a really good influence on me growing up. The other thing is that my mother would make wild accusations against everybody of everything. So while I don't know what happened in the 50s, I do know what happened in the 80s when the accusations started to target me and rearrange history to make her the victim yet again. I knew what a load that was. So my grandma was just, pretty cool to me. Well, you fast forward again several years, and I found out in the end, I finally started to see my grandma for what she really was. She really tried with me. She horrendously blew it with her kids, to say the very least. And her 2 grandkids, my cousins, she blew it with them, and I was kind of her last opportunity to have a family. And she, I would say, did a pretty good job for quite a while. But in the end, I finally got to see how nasty she generally was. And so after not seeing my mom for a long time, I went to go see her, and I actually apologized. I said, yeah, I see what you're talking about now, and, I'm sorry that I doubted you. Of course, this wasn't a happy closure situation because it was just, another excuse for another attack, and on it went. And that's when I realized that it didn't really matter that my grandma died because she lives on through my mom. But doesn't have to live on through me. And all of this, by the way, is a major reason why I've never had kids, because I don't want to consciously or unconsciously pass anything along to another generation. So what was wrong with my grandma? Alright, well, now we're 2 generations back. And we have to go back to her mother, my great-grandma. She lived to 101, which was her claim to fame, so she was around well into my 20s. She was born back in 1897. To me, she was just the little old lady who was, around when the dinosaurs were. She would just sit in a chair, watch Lawrence Welk, the animal shows on PBS. She hated the cats, but loved the animal shows. Never quite understood that. She said maybe 2 words to me. Ever. I didn't care. She was just a fixture, just another piece of furniture to me. She died 10 years before I got into any of this. Well, the other thing that she was known for was 4 marriages, which turned out to be 5 because one was so bad that nobody was supposed to know about it, which means naturally that it's all anybody talked about. And I found him, and I guess he was a bit of a scumbag. And so 5 husbands and an assortment of kids. And what came down to me was husband number 3 came and went pretty quickly. This is kind of making a long story pretty short, but my grandma never knew her dad, which is almost a theme in my family on both sides. And researching him, I never found a divorce, never found anything. He was just out of the picture super quickly for kind of nebulous reasons. And this was back in a time when sleeping around generally required marriage, not always necessarily. But my great-grandma had my grandma, her daughter, and when she was, out dating, more or less, I guess, she would look for babysitters for my grandma. And by babysitters, I mean she would actually take this little girl down the street and just, I guess, knock on doors. She would just find complete strangers for my grandma to shack up with. And the one specific story that made its way to me was something about a guy covered with boils who would let her stay there if she would bathe him. And you can guess where that kind of thing led. And this apparently happened repeatedly. So, yeah, the long story short is one day my mom blurted out that, yeah, mother was getting raped. And needless to say, this was pretty damn shocking to me. I had no idea. And I asked, how do you know this? And she said, well, when she gets drunk. The thing with my mother is that she has lucid moments where she's very intelligent. And having known her for 43 years, I've got a pretty good idea of when she's telling an actual story. And this was one of the actual stories, and it sure as hell made sense. And I ended up with a bit more proof of this kind of thing because, I go digging under every rock. And when I was living with my grandma, I was digging through boxes in the back room and out in the garage and scraping rat crap off of things and trying to salvage and scan what I could. But there is one thing that I never found, and I'm so thankful that I didn't, because the next door neighbor, who was her kind of boyfriend, young enough to be her son and married, but they screwed around a lot, and my grandma was inappropriate about many things, including the particulars of his genitalia. This is one of those where there's smoke, there's fire stories, if you're not guessing, right? Well, talking to him one day, he was telling me that she had some photos that he described as not exactly G-rated of her as a teenager, and the photos were taken by an older guy that she was carrying on a relationship with. And unfortunately, I understood pretty well who that was. So her mom, the one that lived to super old age, who had married 5 times. Husband number 5 was Joe Fitzgerald. And my mom had accused Joe of molesting her. The problem again is that these stories just get thrown around willy-nilly, and she's claimed that everybody has molested her at one time or another, except me. She hasn't made that accusation yet, and I'm not sure how the hell that would work, but I don't know how the hell any of her stories work, honestly. So she had made this accusation and thrown it at Mother. My grandma denied the whole thing. All right, fine, I don't know. But then finding out about this, where, apparently my grandma was carrying on some kind of very nasty situation with her mom's husband, her stepdad. And she thought enough to keep these pictures around and unbelievably want to show them off to people all those decades later. Because I'm digging through stuff in that house, and I found Civil War era photos, all kinds of awesome stuff. She had no idea any of that existed. Forget all that, who cares? But she's keeping around her dirty pictures from the 1930s with this guy. Super gnarly, right? So, the question isn't so much at this point, how did things happen to me? Or how did things happen to my mom? But how did these things happen to my grandma? Well, my great-grandma, she was one of 4 daughters to Elder Johnson, otherwise known as G.E., George Edmund Johnson. He's the guy in the photo. He was a Seventh-day Adventist preacher. Now, unfortunately, he is a perfect example of good intentions paving the road to hell, because he was on a mission to save the world. He was what we'd call a circuit rider, where he was roving all around the Pacific Northwest, up into Canada, down into California, over into Montana, all over the place. He and his wife lived in between 50 and 60 homes, depending on which list you go by. And he was building churches. He was the principal of at least one school. He was doing everything. I mean, he was the big time. And his 4 daughters ended up rebelling quite a bit. They ended up staying Adventist to one extent or another, but since Dad was too busy, saving everybody else, he had no time for his daughters, and so they engaged in this whirlwind, all four of them, of multiple marriages and having kids with whoever and stealing each other's boyfriends, and it's all the crap that gets celebrated on daytime TV now, but to say the least, it was very scandalous at the time. And you ended up with some broken lives out of it because, hey, why not? Mommy's got to get her needs met, right? At least that would be the view that some people would put on this. And who cares what happens to the offspring of this or the generations beyond them, right? As for GE, by every account, he was a truly genuine, decent human being. He absolutely believed in his mission. And he believed that he was doing the right thing. And the right thing turned out to be a horrible family tragedy for many generations. The fascinating part of all of this to me is that, as mentioned at the beginning, occasionally you can pinpoint where things went wrong. And with GE, he was born in 1872 in Minnesota, and I happen to know that this bunch of people back there were converted by a specific guy in the winter of 1873. So at the age of 1, he was in it. He didn't have to look for a life's calling because it found him. He was born right into it, just hand in glove, and off he went. The funny thing about it to me is that the Adventists are extremely obstructionist in my repeated personal experience. With genealogy, you often have to deal with different religions, and you get different people, different religions, whatever. I mean, this church, that church. Sometimes somebody is not pleasant, sometimes somebody is having a good day. You never know what you're going to get. But these people have again and again and again made a point of obstructing me, and apparently this is part of their shtick because the official family genealogy is a colossal load of crap, which is to say people who didn't end up being Adventists just got kicked right out of it. You weren't even worth mentioning. Your life didn't even exist if you were not Adventist to these people. How cute is that? And they would replace those people with nonsense. They had this big royalty myth. I may have mentioned this in a previous video somewhere. Some just utter Disney garbage about a princess running away with her carriage driver. And well-educated people spent well over a century looking for proof of this, and they could never find proof. If you're a princess, then you're royalty, and you're royalty because of your genealogy. I mean, that's how it goes. And if you can't find a scrap of evidence, as though the crown back in England has so many princesses running around that they just lose track. Where'd the princesses go? Did she even exist? Who knows, right? So, replacing reality with fantasy was kind of their deal. And to read their information and their history and their background, you would think that, well, of course we were all Adventist and we've always been Adventist, but the guy who converted them wrote a memoir of passing through that town, and he mentions my ancestors by name and details how several of them were having none of it. They really didn't like him. They didn't like the religion. They wanted nothing to do with any of it. There's at least 2 cases where he managed to convert a couple of wives, and then they dragged their husbands into it. So, so it's all built on a mythology that GE was off perpetuating for the good of the world from his point of view. And so these girls were raised in this, and they ended up fighting against it and rebelling. I can understand that, you would probably feel like you're drowning in this nonsense and you need to get out. Unfortunately, they did it without much consideration of the consequences of their own actions. And the only silver lining I can even possibly consider about my great-grandma dropping my grandma off in strangers' homes is that, well, I guess she didn't give her up to an orphanage because bad things happen in orphanages. I don't know. Is there a lesser of two evils here? I have no idea. I'm not even sure what she was thinking. This is somebody who, she was an Adventist, of course, because Dad was the preacher, and the first marriage officiated by her father was to an Adventist. But then the second guy was some scumbag. The third guy, my ancestor, was a Catholic. That was a colossal no-no, the no-no of no-nos. The fourth guy was a Presbyterian, and then the fifth guy, the one who was apparently carrying on this relationship with my grandma, was another Catholic. You know, toward the end of her life, I would talk to my grandma about all of this and ask her, what the hell was she thinking? Where did she find these people? No idea. A marriage would fail and she'd run off to Daddy, wherever he was, you know. In my case, divorce this Catholic to run off to Montana, where her dad was, and then she met the Presbyterian working in a mine there, and so on and so forth, you know. And it's a trickle-down abuse that's made its way down. The point of this podcast is to let people know that what you've grown up with is not really something that's happened in a microcosm. There is a bigger picture usually to these things. It's stuff that people don't want to talk about, but the more you understand it, the more you can work past it. I don't want to say overcome it because that seems to suggest sweeping it under the rug or something, but to understand where these people came from and to understand that it's not excusing their actions in the slightest, but that the victimizers have usually been victims themselves, and that you can make the conscious decision to not keep repeating this garbage generation after generation. So that's my morbid story. I hope you got something out of it, and thank you for listening.